Je suis Antonia Maioni, directrice de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de l'Université McGill, et c'est avec grand plaisir que je vous accueille au discours annuel James R. Mallory en études canadiennes. Le discours Mallory en études canadiennes a été établi en 1994 en honneur de Jim Mallory, professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université McGill pendant plus de 40 ans. Enseignant hors pair, chef de file dans le développement de la discipline au Canada et un des plus influents universitaires canadiens de sa génération, le professeur Mallory a aussi été une force majeure dans le développement des études canadiennes à McGill. Nous sommes très contents d'accueillir sa famille à Montréal ce soir et les remercier encore une fois pour leur grande générosité en établissant la bourse d'études Mallory. Merci. Et ce soir, c'est pas moi qui va vous présenter notre conférencière, mais bien mon collègue Richard Schultz. Et c'est avec un grand plaisir que je vous le présente. Richard Schultz est directeur du département de sciences politiques et James McGill Professor in Political Science. Il est connu comme un des enseignants les plus appréciés parmi les étudiants dans la faculté des arts. Le professeur Schultz est sans doute un collègue digne de la tradition Mallory à McGill. Professor Schultz.
Merci, Antonia. I was about to call you Antonia. That's an in-joke because I thought for the moment, because I'm getting his girth, that I was Mike Duffy. I have his girth increasingly, and he has my beloved Senate seat. To keep informed about public life, the media generally, and for those of us of a certain age, newspapers in particular, are indispensable. I would argue quite simply that a healthy media sector requires more than, a healthy democracy requires a healthy media sector. A healthy media sector requires more than a diversity of voices, more than wide-ranging and, one would hope, competent information gathering and reporting. And at the top of what is most important in a healthy media sector, I would argue, is that small cadre of journalists known as political columnists. In this respect, Canada has over the years been blessed with an impressive group of columnists such as Blair Fraser, George Bain, André Laurendeau, W.A. Wilson, and I include our distinguished lecturer this evening in that group. Political columnists, when they do their job well, do not simply add to our information base, nor do they add to the buzz of opinion that swirl around our political life. The very best of our columnists expand through their analysis, through our basic understanding of contemporary issues, events, and personalities. In doing so, I would argue that our very best political columnists help shape our understanding of the very nature of our political community. Our speaker tonight is an award-winning journalist who has worked as a reporter covering regional, provincial, and national issues, first for Radio-Canada and later as Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse et Le Devoir. As a reporter, she was instrumental in breaking the famous lobster pot story about Jacques Parizeau's conception of the '95 referendum. In recent years, we have come to know Chantal through her columns in the Toronto Star and Le Devoir. Her style is not given to polemic or to pomposity. There are no gimmicks in her writing, nor does one get a sense that she sees herself as part of any story she is writing about. There is just straightforward, no-nonsense analysis and interpretation that challenges the reader to think more deeply about her subjects. From my personal perspective, I think in her writing style, Chantal closely resembles the late W.A. Wilson when he wrote for the Montreal Star. Of course, one cannot mention Chantal without citing her continuing role on the At Issue panel, normally on Thursday evenings on CBC National News. On this panel, she has truly established a national presence for herself. Personally, I often find myself, and I've long believed in interactive television because I mutter at it all the time, But I find myself, after Peter Mansbridge has posed a question to the panel, muttering, "Don't go to Chantal first, please." I do so because while I value the comments of her colleagues, when Chantal is the last to speak, inevitably she adds extra nuance and insight to any discussion. For me, quite simply, she raises the level of the conversation. Now, as someone who struggles, and has done so for, as you can see, many years, to understand Canadian politics, I have long been interested in how political columnists such as Chantal or Bain or Fraser emerge from the larger field of journalists, how they acquire the skills, the training, the intellectual capacity, not to mention the stamina, to become so preeminent in their field. A few years ago, I thought I had learned part of the reason, at least in Chantal's case. It was at a book launch just the floor above us for Graham Fraser's second edition of his biography of René Lévesque. When Graham took me graciously across the room to introduce me to Chantal, she interrupted him to say, "An introduction is unnecessary. I know Professor Schultz very well. I was his student at Glendon College." For a brief moment, I puffed myself up. I'm told I have a great capacity for puffing myself up. But for a brief moment, I savored the idea that I might be a mini Jim Mallory, whose influence lives on through his students. The moment, unfortunately, was sadly very brief, as Chantal finished her sentence to say, "I was the one in the back row who slept through the lectures." Now, I leave it to others to say if I have improved. But I am absolutely confident that one of Canada's most impressive political commentators will not be sleep-inducing tonight. Please join me in welcoming most warmly a most worthy Mallory lecturer, Chantal Hebert.
I wasn't really sleeping, I was doodling. And to this day, that is what I do during news conferences, because that is how I stay awake through them. And it works. Worked in university, still works to this day. About that Senate seat, there is a large jar of Kool-Aid out there, and if you care to drink it, you can be appointed on Friday. It's waiting for you. Word on language, since we are in Montreal, and I am French-speaking. I am not a federal politician. Nobody writes the speeches for me, and I am not good at switching from one language to another. I raised my children in Toronto to learn that when they speak English, and when they speak French, and the two should not mix, and that's mostly because I can't mix them up. So I will be speaking in English, and I will be answering questions in the language that they are asked. Which is the easy way for me to do this. If anybody asks why I don't want to become a politician, especially a federal one, now you know. I could read you my notes for the at-issue panel tonight. It would take away all your illusions about how sausages get made, because we all get to answer questions and not know what the other answer, and we have to send them in like students because they got sick of speaking with us for an hour every week. So now we get questions, we get to answer, and then we hope for the best. So when I'm not asked first, usually it's because I don't have the most controversial answer. Because if you're asked first on something that allows you to go out on a limb, it usually means you're the only one who's going out on that limb, and the other two will just cut it down with you on it. So it's always good news to hear that voice that says, "Andrew." It's safer. I'm not going to speak about prorogation. These would be my notes for the at-issue panel. And it's a bit boring because I think you've probably heard everything there is to hear about pro-immigration one way or the other over the past month. And if you haven't made up your minds yet, you still have until March 3rd to make up your mind. So you'll get to hear a lot more because we have precious little else to write about and to cover. So we should give us a chance. We should be able to bore you with the impact of it, the meaning of it, and then repeat it again and again and get ourselves to March 3rd. So I will talk to you about the Canadian political landscape, which for a while I've been arguing is in the process of being restructured. And I found, once I gave McGill my title, I found a sexier title, and it was After the Handshake, and I'll explain why it took me so long to come up with it. The main reason is that I didn't think of the After the Handshake until someone else had a great idea. A few weeks ago, Dan Arnold, who is a liberal blogger who writes for the National Post, which makes him a very rare bird, asked his readers to select the top Canadian political event of the first decade of the 21st century. And among the issues that came up in the list in the top 10, Canada's refusal to join the United States in Iraq, same-sex marriage, the sponsorship scandal, all made the top 10, as did, for a strange reason, the Clarity Act, which I think was in a previous century and meant to stay there. But go figure. Blogging, as I've discovered, involves a number of little accidents along the way. The event that came first was actually a picture. And it was dated October 16, 2003, and it showed then Canadian Alliance leader Stephen Harper and then Progressive Conservative leader Peter MacKay shaking hands on the heels of their joint announcement that they would merge their two warring parties. And from where I sit, Arnold's readers had it right. That handshake was the top game changer of the past decade in Canadian politics, and it continues to generate tremors on the federal scene. It set in motion a restructuring of the landscape that is ongoing to this day. It has forced every party to rethink their own assumptions, and it will, when all this plays out, probably result in a very different political scene and very different dynamics than from those that we presumed were the dynamics that underpinned the Canadian political landscape in the 20th century. Now, in the fall of 2003, it was tempting. It was, in fact, very natural for those of us who witnessed the handshake to just conclude that the reconciliation between the Tories and the Reform Party simply meant a return to business as usual, to the pre-1993, the Conservatives, the Liberals, mostly middle of the road, and the NDP somewhere in there, and well, the Bloc Québécois, as usual, was seen as some kind of a detail. They were going to fade away, I guess, in the landscape, and we would all go back to the way business is supposed to be conducted in the House of Commons. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that the events of that day set in motion something much more fundamental. It has already taken Parliament, the federal parties, the Governor-General into relatively uncharted territories. Think of a rewritten Liberal NDP budget in 2005. Who would have thought that the NDP would write a budget with the finance minister, then prime minister, who had the reputation for writing the finances of the country, and then open your books and let Jack Layton write a poem with all that money. A really interesting arrangement. Or the proposed 2008 opposition coalition, which went even further than the rewriting of a budget to get the government to survive. The Harper-MacKay handshake reversed the dynamics between the two main federal parties in favor of the Conservatives, but it also changed the outlook of the NDP and the Bloc Québécois on their own place in the larger scheme of Parliament. And today I want to focus on how the 6.5 years old handshake has changed the four main federal parties and the dynamics between them. And I'll start, of course, with the Conservatives. Now, before the handshakes, yes, Professor Schultz would have thought the elements of a winning Conservative coalition, as few and far between as those were, included Red Tories, Quebec nationalists, Western Canada affirmationists, and always with the Red Tories in the lead and the Conservative right wing, a vocal rump of the Progressive Conservative Party. Quebec and Alberta were the two pillars of that structure. That would very briefly sum up Brian Mulroney's recipe to win power and win majority governments, but it was also Joe Clark's recipe, although he didn't achieve it and the cake failed to rise. that those were the ingredients that went into it, and they were ultimately a refinement of the ingredients that went into Diefenbaker's majority in the 50s. After the handshake, the Red Tories became, at best, the tail that wags the dog, and that is on a good day under Stephen Harper. If you look at what has been happening over the past month, those of you who have been reading about what has happened at Rights and Democracy, a think tank that is, in theory, at arm's length from the government, and where the board has been at each other's throat over ideology, with the chairman under stress, actually dying after a board meeting. What you see there is a battle between conservative appointees and other conservative appointees. This is not a battle that has pitted liberals who were left over from a previous regime and conservatives who were being sent there to clean up. Everyone on that board and the chairperson, the president, were all conservative appointees. So within the Conservative Party of Mr. Harper, the battle between hard right conservatives and former Tories is ongoing. And there is no doubt that those who are winning that battle at this point are not the Red Tories. The strains of the Alberta-Quebec alliance, as demonstrated under Brian Mulroney, I think have not been lost on Stephen Harper. And while in his first mandate he did make an attempt to try to make significant inroads in Quebec, I think the real foundation of the new Conservative Party are the rich provinces, Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario, with a sprinkling of Quebec seats, but mostly drawn from the former social credit area. There's been no significant effort on the part of Mr. Harper to make inroads in the Montreal area, or even in the suburbs around Montreal. He has been very happy to focus on where he hopes he will find more conservative voters. I was very struck prior to the last election. I met his campaign chair for an hour and a half, and at some point we started talking about Quebec, and at that point the polls were frankly rather good for the Conservatives in Quebec. And he says, Mr. Harper didn't ask me to win him 30 seats in Quebec or even 20 seats. He asked me to win him some Conservative seats. And I do think that when he looks at the infrastructure of where he wants the party to be, he wants the party to be solid in Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. And within 10 years, through demographics and seat redistribution, it will be possible in this country to craft majority governments without Quebec. And frankly, not the mathematical proposition that it is at this point. In 2003, I think most of us were guilty of thinking that the tilt to the right of the Conservative Party was a passage obligé, that Mr. Harper would lead the reunited party to bring the alliance reform back, and then reality would reassert itself and the progressives would retake over the party. In fact, that proposition was probably wrong, and there is no real reason to believe that there will be a return of the pendulum towards the progressive side of the party after Stephen Harper. Part of the reason is that in Alberta and Ontario, the momentum within conservative ranks is on the right of the right. In Alberta, the Conservatives are in the process of being overtaken by a new party on the right of them. And in Ontario, the demise of John Tory has brought the right wing of the architects of the common sense revolution, or at least their sons and daughters, have taken over control of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. And those movements that are happening in Ontario and Alberta within conservative circles are not happening in a vacuum divorced from the federal Conservative Party. On the contrary, they are part and parcel of what's happening to the conservative movement. Throughout the Chrétien year, the Reform Alliance provided much of the inspiration for what became big liberal policies. Eliminating the deficit in the first Chrétien mandate. That was something that was unconscionable. Only rednecks would imagine that Canada would suffer through what it would take to bring the deficit to zero. The Clarity Act, which was called, I think, the 20 Conditions when Stephen Harper wrote it, that was a recipe for disaster in this country, and it was a good reason why you wouldn't want the Reform Party to ever run Canada, because it would split it right down the middle by putting conditions on secession. Today, the think tanks that produced those ideas when their masters who are in federal politics, and I'm thinking of Preston Manning in particular, are continuing to prime the policy pump for the conservative movement. And I would argue doing it with a lot more imagination at this point than whatever their equivalent are on the Liberal side. Moreover, institutes like that are also training candidates. They're training the organizers of tomorrow. This is not a party that has been losing time and power or waiting to go back to the mushy middle. On the contrary, the right of the party has firmed up its support. And finally, there is funding, and he who pays the piper does call the tune, and in the Conservative Party, a solid network of socially and fiscally conservative groups tap into their memberships to finance the party, and they do it quite successfully. The old Tories were funded by elites, and the elites elected their leader. Harper's party is writing a new book on grassroots financing, and that is who will pick the next leader. And those people are not hanging out at the Calgary Club with Jim Prentice. Or they're not waiting to go see a Jean Charest speech in Saskatoon. So the Liberals are talking increasingly about changing their leadership rules to move increasingly towards one person, one vote. As they do that, expect the Conservative Party and Mr. Harper's side of that party to take advantage of that to change one rule that he had to accept to merge with the Tories, and that is that every riding in the country was weighted to have the same number of votes. The day you take that away, the people who elect the leader of the Conservative Party for a long, long time will be people who are to the right of center and who are in Alberta and who are strong conservatives. Western Canada and Ontario will call the shots because empty ridings in Quebec are not going to be making, or in Toronto or Vancouver, are not going to be determining who the leader is. Turning to the Liberals. Before the handshake, everything was so nice. The Liberal coalition was widely applauded as the most successful of the 20th century, rightly. There was heady talk of a Paul Martin landslide. 220 seats, said a Conservative organizer who used to work for Stockwell Day. And disquiet in circles like mine about Liberal-friendly, Liberal dictatorship and one-party rule in Canada. After the handshake. About a year after the handshake, the Liberals lost first their majority, then power. And while they've tried for a long time to ignore it, more was at play both times than a fluke, called the sponsorship scandal, or a poor leadership gamble. The reality is that over the Chrétien year, the division on the right eclipsed the erosion that was taking place within the Liberal Party. When your neighbor's house has fallen to pieces, it's tempting to look at all the rebuilding he has to do and not check your own foundation. And that is what the Liberals do. I'll give you some numbers because I collect them. I have been collecting them for a long time, probably in part because I live in this province and I raise a son who was born in 1983 and has absolutely no memory of this province having been a Liberal fortress. Since Pierre Trudeau retired, leaving behind some burnt bridge in Quebec and Alberta over the patriation of the Constitution and the NEP, the Liberals have failed to win back a majority in Quebec 7 times. That's a long time in politics, 7 elections, and most of them didn't happen every year and a half. We're talking a lot of 4-year cycles. Over that period, the Liberals have faced a united Conservative Party in 5 elections and lost 4 of them. The only election that they won since 1980 against a united Conservative Party was 2004, where Mr. Harper was still in the process of rebuilding the reunited party, and Paul Martin managed to get a minority. Those are a rather sobering number. Last year, federal by-elections took place in 4 ridings. The 4 seats at play involved a rural seat in Atlantic Canada, a suburban seat in British Columbia, a rural francophone seat in Quebec, and a city core seat in Montreal. The Liberals came in third in every single one of them, and the rationale that they put forward to explain it was that they had not won a single one of them in 20 years. Now, if you can't win for 20 years seats that are so different and that reflect such a variety of regions and makeup, then the problems go much beyond leadership. And that is why probably there will not be a quick fix. The problem is not only that the Conservatives have come back together, but in Quebec, for instance, the disappearance of unity as a top of the mind issue. And it was still the issue that defined the party under Jean Chrétien. That disappearance has had a liberating impact on Federalist voters, and they fanned out in a variety of directions. Some have gone to the Conservatives, but others have gone to the NDP. Over the last decade, since Jean Chrétien left, the Liberal Party has lost 20 percentage points in Quebec. Few of these votes went to the Bloc Québécois. The Liberals won 44% of the vote in the last Chrétien election. That was the election right after the Clarity Act. And at the time, the Bloc had 39% of the vote. Since then, the Bloc has basically had 38, 37. Its vote is held steady, and it matches the support for sovereignty in the polls, the high 30s at best. Even after the sponsorship scandal, the Bloc still couldn't get to 40%. What has happened, though, is that the NDP and the Conservatives have taken up the slack and have taken up that space. After the by-elections where the Liberals ran third, I looked at the sample of Quebec ridings. Now, I was very scientific about it because I didn't only take his course at Glennon, I took a statistics course, and it has marked me to this day. I have no method. So I went through the alphabetical listing, and I picked 4 or 5 seats at the top of the list. I figured if this proves my point, then there is really a Liberal problem in Quebec because this is really arbitrary. So I ended up with, seats in rural Abitibi, ethnically diverse seats like Ahuntsic, Anjou. You can see I was true to my alphabetical order. Semi-industrial riding like Argenteuil, federalist riding like Beauce. And then I stopped. Those are all areas, by the way, and that was where I was picky. I looked and I made sure I picked areas where Jean Charest Liberals actually do well. And from 2000 to 2008, the federal Liberals in those ridings lost anywhere from 10 to 40 percentage points, while the NDP and the Conservatives doubled, tripled, or quadrupled their votes. And from a national institution, the Liberal Party has become an Ontario party with an Atlantic Canada branch plant. Now, the NDP, before the handshake, the NDP wasn't doing so well. It had even lost its status in the House of Commons for a while. After the handshake, an era of minority rule at least allowed the NDP to return to some kind of a pivotal role in the House of Commons. And Jack Layton, to his credit, has made the most of that role to try to think out of the old NDP box. The risk, because there was a risk involved in co-writing a budget, trying to bring a coalition into being, accepting for the first time, being the first NDP leader to say, not only will I support the Liberals in government, but I will actually take seats in that government. That is something that many NDP members have feared for a long time, something that previous NDP leaders used to refuse, and that Jack Layton was quite open to. I think also that the failure of the coalition was the heartbreaker for Layton because he has recognized that the only way back to a position of influence for the NDP would ideally involve a different approach to interacting with the other parties. And in this, he is right. The notion that the NDP is an influence in the House of Commons, that it influences policy by playing the old game, the way it worked in the 70s, that hasn't worked for the NDP in a long, long time. Try to think of an idea, a single policy that Jean Chrétien passed, where you can say, gee, the NDP was so important in that happening. Now the NDP has kept the government alive over the past fall, but it has kept it alive by accepting crumbs that fall off Stephen Harper's table on EI and not by getting any major concession that Mr. Layton can really take to voters. So at this point, Jack Layton's strategy stands waiting for a dancing partner. He has made all the steps. He's standing in the middle of that dance floor. And the voters are not going to allow him to overtake the Liberals. But at the same time, he has a party that is the main opposition, riding by riding, to the Conservatives throughout most of Western Canada. He also has managed to make inroads in Quebec. I live in Outremont, and if I were Mr. Cochon, I would hang on to my day job. Because my MP, Mr. Mulcair, as not necessarily in the process of wrapping it up to give it to him in the next election. Now, I suggested in my blog this morning that l'Oratoire Saint-Joseph might be a good place. It's also in the writing for Mr. Cochon to spend time in, because it's one thing to have a safe Liberal seat, and it's another thing to win it back once someone has taken it. And in this case, he's hanging on to it. But at the same time, the NDP is the Greens eating away at it. It's very odd to cover politics these days because everybody wants to be somebody else. So the Greens want to be the NDP want to be the Liberals, and the Liberals would like to be the Conservatives in power. You kind of look and think, how did we get there? Which is kind of nice for Mr. Harper because they're so busy wanting to be the next guy that is next on the left to them that meanwhile, Stephen Harper is pretty much alone. I was writing about very interesting study on public financing and what it has done to the parties, co-authored by Tom Flanagan, who, because he had such a key role with Stephen Harper, means that you should pay attention to what he writes because they might pay attention to what he writes. That's the way journalism works. You can be very bright, but if you're not sure that the Prime Minister is reading the very bright guy, you probably won't have much of a chance to read the very bright guy either unless you have spare time. So he was, in what they put forward in that study, which I found fascinating, was the notion that the public financing reform brought in by Jean Chrétien, in the end, was not revenue neutral. It made every party rich, and it made parties like the Conservative very, very rich. They got twice as much under the new regime as they were earning from corporate or big donations before the new regime. But I was trying to find my way through there, and he was explaining that they were having a kind of a full-time campaign, and that this was where our country was going. And I thought it's interesting because the Liberals have paid for the Conservatives to build themselves one of the most formidable, at our expense, by the way, one of the most formidable political machines, but they have failed to catch on to that. And now we are in a system where what he was pointing out is before they had all this money, our federal parties, they didn't have money to have a permanent war room, to spend full-time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to pay for attack ads, and to keep us in a permanent air war. But what I found interesting when I was thinking about it was that over the past year, every single party has been in the business of buying attack ads. But with one exception, the obvious, the Liberals, every other party bought attack ads to attack the Liberals. What's wrong with this picture? They are not in power. But that is who the NDP and the Bloc, in part, paid to attack, and not the government. And that tells you something about the dynamics that is taking place on the other side of the ledger. Finally, a word on the Bloc Québécois, a party that we don't cover, and that we spend a lot of time taking for granted. Before the handshake, the split on the right obscured the mathematical consequences of a majority of Quebec's 75 seats being pulled out of the equation of making up federal governments. After the handshake, that reality suddenly couldn't no longer be ignored, and after more than 10 years of existence, the Bloc suddenly became, oh gee, it's stopping us from having majority governments. Yeah, well, that was the whole idea. And if the right hadn't had a fight, it would have happened before. But things have been happening to Mr. Ducep's party too, before and after the handshake. Before the handshake, for instance, Gilles Duceppe would not have been caught dead promoting the idea that one Federalist party was preferable to another in government. After the handshake, he shook the hand of Stéphane Dion and signed a deal to put him in power and to help the Liberals come back in power, which he got away with, but was astounding. And I'm told Lucien Bouchard was so incensed when he saw that handshake that he jumped on the phone. He broke the first phone. But he finally kept one in working order, and he called Gilles Duceppe and couldn't reach him, and then he let everyone know that he was going to write an op-ed piece about this handshake. And Gilles Duceppe had to call him 17 times and leave messages 17 times before finally Mr. Bouchard would talk to him and take a Valium. So that handshake was quite something. You know, the Bloc has a lot of longevity. Some of it is undoubtedly tied to Gilles Duceppe's personality. It is a one-man party. it's just that the man was not Lucien Bouchard, it was Gilles Duceppe. And it has had one real leader throughout its history. And when he goes, who knows? But they have their vote is tied to people who support sovereignty. And one of my colleagues once, I thought, defined with a lot of insight what has happened to the Bloc. And it has gone from being a sovereigntist party, which it clearly was in the mid-90s when there was a referendum coming, to a party of sovereigntists. A party that allows sovereigntists to participate in federal politics, which is very different. And when you cover the Bloc in the House of Commons, there is very little time spent talking about sovereignty. They are talking for sovereigntists about things that are federal. And that is quite an interesting evolution, but it does not go the way of the prompt disappearance of the Bloc, as long as Mr. Duceppe is replaced as leader. And having frustrated all of the policy wonks who are here, and who would hope that people like me would talk about something other than politics, I do have one last page to redeem myself and give Mr. Schultz some reason to think that he didn't waste all of his time trying to drum something other into my head and who does what to whom, although it is a lot of what policy and politics is about. Very strange that over this time when parties have been restructuring themselves and trying to find new places for themselves in the environment, and some of them not succeeding but still in the process of trying, that some of the lines that on the policy front that used to define liberals and conservatives in recent history, I'm not going back to the Federation's founding, but issues on which I covered federal election, and that was where the line was. And one of those, Canada-US relations, the free trade debate, the debate over NAFTA to a smaller degree a few years later. If we changed Prime Minister tomorrow, I don't think that President Obama would need a very, very long briefing to be told about what would be different the next morning. I'm assuming we would change and not have Jack Layton as Prime Minister, as I say this. But he would probably have the shortest briefing on a change of regime in Ottawa that a president would have had in 20 or 25 years. That's how close the two main parties are on this. Unity. Remember unity and all those battles. They want distinct society. We're liberals. We want a strong central blah, blah. They say the same thing on the nations issue. Their leader of one proposed it. The leader of the other put it to the House of Commons. They all voted for it. No one's talking about it. They say the same thing about the oil sands, which to me is part of the next unity issue in Alberta. And last week when Mr. Harper shuffled his cabinet and gave a Quebecer responsibility for natural resources and hence the oil sands, the Bloc Québécois came out shooting, and it was Marc Garneau, the critic of the Liberals and the Quebec lieutenant to the Liberals, who actually stood up to defend Christian Paradis, the Quebec lieutenant of the Conservatives, on the issue of the oil sands. The environment, now that the Liberals have pushed the carbon tax and talk about a cap and trade, to tell you the truth, except in emphasis and in having your hand over your heart rather than your fingers crossed behind your back, they're not promoting very different policies on how to deal with climate change. Economic plan, Mr. Harper's plan apparently was so liberal that the Liberals have yet to put forward an alternative economic plan to his plan to fight the recession. But since the recession is over, better to take credit for his plan than to try to come up with something else. It makes sense, but it is not an issue on which there is something that the voters could say, if I had this guy, I would have had this and not that. Foreign affairs on Afghanistan, does anybody know where there is a major difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives? They extended the mission together. They're going to end it together. They're both struggling to find a way to have a presence in Afghanistan. They're not looking at very different things. The options are limited. Where there is a significant difference between the two of them is in the running of the Federation. The Conservatives, under the current Prime Minister, are happy to let the provinces have the run and the leadership of the social union, an issue that will become fairly important when current arrangements on healthcare, for instance, run out at a time when everyone is trying to balance the books. On the other hand, Prime Minister Stephen Harper is aggressively seeking to affirm the federal leadership of the economic union and pushing the envelope on that front where Liberals feared to tread, in particular with a single market regulator, but not exclusively on that issue. The Liberals support Conservative efforts on the front of the economic union. But they also believe that there should be a federal role of leadership to assume on the social union front. And that is where they have yet to find a way to sell a view like that to Quebec, to Alberta, and increasingly to provinces like Ontario. There is no way to overstate the damage that the cuts to the transfers for healthcare under Paul Martin did to the province's capacity to buy into any future national social scheme, childcare, any other, because the memories from that was that when the federal government has money, it buys you into a program, and when it's broke, it walks away and leaves you with the bills. And on that basis, the Liberal view of a federal leadership role is failing so far to meet the test of credibility. What is more interesting is that the Liberals actually failed to use the surplus to advance their position on the social union over the Chrétien-Martin years. And we are now entering a cost-cutting era, and a Liberal government would frankly not have the means of its social ambitions. And that tells me that whatever we are doing, the Conservatives, if they stay in power, will have a license to remold the federal government, i.e. shrink to their vision of what it should be. And if they are not in power, the Liberals will too, because that's what they will have to do to balance the books, and the official opposition will be Conservative, and it will be encouraging them down that road. So that great debate about the vision of Canada, I would suggest, is already over. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chantal.